So good morning and welcome to this concurrent session as a part of Concordia College's 2024 MLK programming. The name of this concurrent session is Accompanying Palestinians, Stories and Perspectives Rooted in Relationship, and we'll be going from 9:30 until 10:15. I want to recognize right away that that is not nearly enough time to even kind of begin this conversation or to enter into it if you've already been a part of a conversation about accompanying Palestinians. I'd like to introduce our conversation partners this morning, and then I'm going to share some brief expectations. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Jenny Sung, who's the launch coordinator for the ELCA's SUMUD for Justice in Palestine and Israel. Welcome and good morning, Pastor Jenny.
Sabah al-khair. Good to be here with you all.
Thank you. And then our second special conversation guest is Reverend Colin Grangaard. Colin is the former country coordinator in Jerusalem and the West Bank for the ELCA's Young Adults in Global Mission Program, also called YAGM. Good morning, Pastor Colin.
Good morning. Marhaba. That one.
Very grateful to you both for joining us. I'm also deeply grateful for Christina Johnson-Dernier, who is the Director for Communications, Events, and Youth Ministry for the Northwestern Minnesota Synod of the ELCA. And Christina is helping manage this Zoom and will be handling all of the questions and comments that you want to share via the chat. So if you have any questions or topics that you want to share or be focused on, please do use that in the chat, submit that to the chat. In terms of some opening expectations management, what I want to share is where the idea for this session came from. In the midst of the Israel-Hamas war, in the midst of a student march on campus, in the midst of the now conversation about genocide that's being held internationally, about the actions that are happening in Gaza specifically, I've been asking myself, what does it mean to be a good and informed global neighbor with my Palestinian neighbors? So that is the impetus for this concurrent session. So what we're doing is we're leaning into the ongoing church relationship between the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, which is the church with which Concordia College is affiliated, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. And that's a decades-long relationship. And it's a relationship to which the ELCA frequently looks to understand the lives of Palestinian people in the region. Our purpose then is to enter into a deeper understanding of what is going on in the region of Gaza and around Gaza, to have a deeper understanding of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinian people, and to broaden and deepen our understanding of the current war and its impact on Palestinian people. We have a shared goal of encouraging further engagement, learning, and conversation. And as such, we'll be sending out a list of resources to all email accounts that have entered into this Zoom. You'll receive that within this work week. So you'll receive that on or before Friday of this week. If you have entered into a Zoom with somebody else, then make sure that they share that list of resources with you. In terms of some further expectations, you'll note that none of the four of us are Palestinian people. And that's purposeful with the design of this particular concurrent session. So we cannot speak on behalf of Palestinian people, and we cannot answer questions of what would a Palestinian person say, see, experience. And in that vein, our encouragement is to withhold judgment and to wonder and wander alongside Palestinian people. And with that, we're going to open up with both of our special guests, Pastor Jenny and Pastor Colin, responding to this question: how did you come to know and care about Palestinian people and their lives? And that's a big question, but I've asked our special guests to keep their answers relatively brief. So, Pastor Jenny, how did you come to know and care about Palestinian people and their lives?
Sure. So in 2019 was the first time I had ever visited the Holy Land. And as a pastor, I thought it was just going to be, okay, you check it off the list, you saw the holy sites. And the gift was going and you hear about the living stones. You hear not only about how God moved, but how God continues to move in the people, in the land, in their passion for the land, for hospitality and one another. I went again then in 2000. Well, I went every year after that. And what I found was it hit me so hard. I was a part of the movement with George Floyd in the Twin Cities. I'm from the Twin Cities. And so I did a lot of street ministry and felt very connected to that movement and to what was going on and how it was a larger conversation. And then I went to the Holy Land, and the first day I was there, a 7-year-old was murdered on his bicycle. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. And then the next day there were more people being murdered. And what struck me for the first time was George Floyd happens multiple times a day. And not just to grown men, but to children, to women, to men. And to think that they're going through that trauma every day, multiple times a day, and even more so with what's happening in Gaza, it really hit home for me because I mean, we saw how our country responded to George Floyd. And to see the voice of the Palestinian people not be able to lament and to grieve and to rise up in a similar way because of everything that was going on or that continues to go on was just heart-wrenching. And so that's when, pardon, that's when I just became an advocate. That's when my world was changed to become an advocate to free Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. Pastor Colin, how about you? How did you come to know and care about Palestinian people and their lives?
Yeah, thanks, Deacon Jon, for so much for the opportunity to join you here. My wife is also a pastor, and we were blessed. She won the graduate preaching fellowship at Luther Seminary, which is a distinction at the end of study. And so the one rule for that fellowship was to spend a year out of the contiguous United States. We started with a proposal that included a lot more travel in Africa. But so we ended up going to East Africa for a few months. And then we had planned to go to South Africa like you, John, but it was the year that they were hosting the World Cup. And we were encouraged by some of the missionaries there to go somewhere else. And so Mark Brown was the Jerusalem representative for the Lutheran World Federation at the time, and when we emailed him curious if he would take on, two new wannabe pastors, he just sent back the email, come and see what we're doing, and we'll find a spot for you. And so we ended up having a lovely experience, getting exposed to both the community on the Mount of Olives where this is taken, and also sort of some of the church community within the ELCJHL. That first 5 months there ended up, being very sort of formative in how we approach ministry. But it wasn't until 5 years later that the Young Adults in Global Mission country coordinator position opened. And so I had been a young adult pastor at Trinity in Moorhead, just down the street from Concordia. At the time that the position opened, I was a pastor in Barnesville at Our Savior's. And so Jenny and I decided to throw our hats in the ring. And I still marvel that they invited us to go there and accompany not only the Palestinians, but the Young Adults in Global Mission for those 4 years that we were there. what I would say about learning about life among Palestinians and life in Jerusalem, one of the things that just drew me so immediately was how complex all of the different perspectives were. Every person has such a unique story, and every background is so deeply rooted in history, not only a history that you hear from the Bible, but a faith history as rich as the Abrahamic traditions are able to express. It was also kind of amazing to be able to not only visit the schools where the ELCJHL spends a lot of its resources for ministry, but then down the street, they would be places that showed up in the Bible, places that we talk about in terms of, the growth of faith. And so every location and every family story, had these deep roots with very sort of complex narratives. And it was a story that we wanted to take time to hear.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those answers. Our plan next in this concurrent is for Pastor Colin to share a thumbnail history, recognizing that this is just a sketch. It's just a thumbnail of the last 100 years in the region, in order for us to learn from that history and to have some deeper understanding and context for further conversation today. So, Colin, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, this is going to be very ambitious to cover this. What we're really, it ends up actually being about 140 years of history. I decided to start with this slide because this is the dump at Caesarea on the sea, and so all of these are pot shards that people threw away, and when the archaeologists came upon it, they left it so that you could see the different layers of history that had unfolded there, through the clay pots, which are the styrofoam cup of the ancient world. All of these different pieces that unfold there in the Holy Land, sometimes they can seem like individual instances with their own motives, but there's such a deep history there when it comes time to sort of look a little bit more at how these different issues developed. I think it's important to start out with, acknowledging, I hear all the time that the Holy Land is just a place that's constantly embroiled in war. And so what I want to look at in our timeline to start out with is this idea of the last major national transition that Palestine had before the establishment of the nation of Israel was when the Ottoman Empire incorporated it in the 1500s. And so if you compare sort of the changeover in leadership, the empires that come and go in Jerusalem to, maybe places like London and Paris and Vienna, it is actually a much more stable history when it comes to the last 1,000 or even 2,000 years than many of the European nations that we're used to talking about. And so the problem, the conflict, we don't, you'll hear from Palestinians often that we're not talking about a conflict between the religions. We're talking about a conflict around land. And it happens that the conflict around land, and that's important because there are differences between religions that can't be resolved. But if it's about land, then maybe there's some negotiation compromise that can be resolved. As you look at the timeline, this dream of Zionism is here, but that's not really the narrative that I'm going to emphasize. Instead, the narrative of the Palestinians sort of comes in response to these different waves of Zionism that come at first in the 1800s. So few Jews were coming from Central Europe that it really didn't make anyone nervous. But then in the early 1900s, things became formalized. So do you remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War I, it was clear that the Allied forces were going to win and that the Ottoman Empire was going to dissolve. And so, at a big meeting in Europe, the Allied forces split up the remainders of the Ottoman Empire. And so these different areas that are now still, experiencing conflict, some of them because of these sort of lines drawn on the page haphazardly in Europe, are still experiencing the consequences. And so you'll see just the little partition there where the Holy Land is, that purple part that has Gaza, Jerusalem, that becomes a British mandate. And the white paper, there's the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, his name is Balfour, Ian Balfour, and he writes a promise to a Jewish advocate for Zionism named Rothschild, promising that there would be that the British Empire intended to help to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so when it became formalized like that, there began protests and a number of different Palestinian responses, including a weekly paper that sort of updated, people in the area about what exactly was happening, with this idea of changing Palestine and the demographics of it. As Jews came from Central Europe, they organized and they learned, some different strategies. Since the local Palestinian Arabs had sort of entrenched themselves against the idea that a colonial power would give away their homes, they revolted. And so, there were a couple of different major battles between the British, who were, the British Mandate, and then the Palestinians. The Great Palestinian Revolt is in 1936. That ends up being a time where the Palestinians end up largely demilitarized, by the British Empire. And so, a picture that starts to emerge is that the Palestinians very early on weren't resourced in terms of, having military supplies. They didn't have arms, they didn't have guns, because after the Great Palestinian Revolt, they were demilitarized. And a handful of those Jews that had made Aliyah had joined the British forces, and so they were being educated in some of the different military tactics at the time, as well as getting exposure to things like tanks and the different weapons of war at the time. 1947 is not only the year of the Palestinian partition question, but also the first year that the UN comes to be. One of the small handful of issues that were immediately facing the UN was the issue of the Palestine question. One of the best resources out there is if you go online and Google UN Palestine question, the UN has a library full of statistics and stories and historical timelines like this. But that sort of puts the future of Palestine in the hands of the international community. Now, that seems like a very good idea to you and I, but if you can imagine the 750,000 Palestinians who lived in the region at the time thought that they should have a little bit louder say in what happened in their future. And so there was a lot of resistance to the idea that the UN would be responsible for deciding the future of Palestine, rather than the Palestinians themselves. In 1947, this is sort of on the edge of the establishment of the nation of Israel, and so sometimes it's helpful to see where people lived. In 1947, Jewish people had been making Aliyah and moving to the Holy Land for almost 50 years. And about 10 to 15% of the population, depending on who you talk to, was Jewish at that time. And so you can see where they mostly were settling along the coast, and then inlands towards the Sea of Galilee. And so when we show this picture just to sort of show how things developed over the years. In 1948, then basically the British Empire, having depleted most of its resources during World War II, said, and within Israel, they were dealing with terrorism. The Haggadah had bombed the British Mandate's headquarters at the Jerusalem Hotel, and or the King David Hotel, and so basically the Queen, the British leadership said, okay, we're done with Palestine. And so they set a date in May 1948. They announced that they would be withdrawing all of their troops. And at midnight on May the 15th of 1948, the independent nation of Israel was announced. And so that produces, so what we're looking at in terms of issues, immediately the tanks start to roll out from the different Zionist organizations that were organized, and they immediately move to move towards Jerusalem. And so the picture on the left is that same picture of where people are living in 1947, and then the picture on the right is the villages that were systematically destroyed and razed in 1948. And so it sort of depends what you call a village in terms of the numbers around this. Some people would say that the number is as large as 400 Palestinian villages. The lower end on that is more like 200 Palestinian villages were razed to the ground, and the people were made refugees. And so that at the time, the outline that you see to show the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at the end of the war in 1948, that becomes the green line, the armistice line, which is expressly not a national line, but instead where the ceasefire stopped. And that is a political choice so that no one would, so that the international community wouldn't consider this a final status agreement, right? Because both groups of people, both ethnicities, wanted the opportunity to maybe change how things had lined up. So these years between 1948 and the first decades afterwards are extremely complicated, and so I don't really know how to summarize it quickly, except to say that during this period the nation of Israel is growing in population, and also the Palestinian people who were in those villages are actively being kept out of the region. And so it's called the infiltrator law. And so one of the statistics on the UN's website says that during the period during the decade of the 1950s, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were catching as many as 1,000 infiltrators a day. But that word infiltrator is complicated, because what those are refugees who are trying to return to their depopulated villages. And so, but they're the goal of the nation is to remove some of those populations to this sort of, to make a Jewish section and an Arab section of the land.
Pastor Colin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but because of time, I wonder if you can go back a slide and simply show us the chronology slide.
Yeah.
I think you did a fantastic job of helping us understand how this has been and continues to be a dispute over land. And I wonder if we can actually have our handoff now to Pastor Jenny to have some understanding of what is happening in the region today. But before that handoff, Colin, I wonder if there are one or two more things that you want to share.
Yeah. So the other major piece, okay, so 1967, the Six-Day War. In it, Israel literally conquers all of the space that that had been left over from 1948. And so uh, the land, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula were entirely occupied by Israeli forces. They in the 70s they chose to remove themselves from the Sinai Peninsula because it was too much land to keep. But this is where the conflict really starts in 1960. In the establishment of the nation of Israel, but it's increasingly complicated because in 1967 they took the land, but they chose not to annex it, because if they annexed it, they would be receiving the entire Palestinian population that lived there, and that would make them an apartheid state. And so when it comes to where the people went, at the moment there are 5 point. So these are some of the Palestinian refugee camps around the region. And so when you envision sort of, what happened to the Palestinian people, why is it that, Gaza in particular is so kind of volatile? When you look at Gaza, for the size of it, it's completely filled with refugee camps. And so the people who are living in Gaza, I heard a statistic once that for every native, person who lived in Gaza before 1948, there are at least five, families that are refugees. And so, when we're looking at Gaza, we're looking at a place that's almost entirely filled with people who used to live in that southern region around Israel, even as far north as Jaffa and Tel Aviv. And so, just when we look at sort of how things have unfolded during the peace process, this is some of the peace. Some of the way that things have looked as we've started to move into the peace process. Area A, B, and C have major are the way that we limit the movement of Palestinians. And so you see these two statistics at this point in time. The percentage of the West Bank off limits for Palestinian use is around 61%. And that idea of these different networks, the settlement movement, the settlement movement is so rarely in the news, but is so impactful on what is happening in Israel, Palestine, that it's worth just sort of pointing out these network of roads that you see in blue. They connect the settlements, and Palestinians are not allowed to drive on them in the West Bank. And so if one is a Palestinian who is trying to move between the checkerboard major cities, one must drive through gravel roads and you always take the long way. And so seeing that especially too in Gaza, the settlements have been removed from Gaza, but in the Israeli memory and the Palestinian memory, it's only a few 15 years that change has happened. And so where we are right now is extremely complicated, and one of the hardest parts about talking then about two nations in one region is that the settlement movement has really been about undermining that idea that there would be a contiguous Palestinian state. And so so where we are now is this, as we headed off to Jenny. It's a very complicated picture, but part of that complicated picture has been a very sort of intentional and organized progression, throughout history.
Thank you so much. What a tall order we gave you. And thank you very much for sharing that history and that context, and informed by your own experience and perspective. So Pastor Jenny, maybe a good transition is to just ask you, where are you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was supposed to be joining you from Bethlehem today, and unfortunately, because of the conflict and the trouble with moving back and forth, I am stuck in Jordan. So, not that that's a bad place to be. Jordan is also fantastic and beautiful, and it's not Bethlehem. So I'm joining you from Amman today, Jordan, and just talking a little bit about what we have going on now. Now, oftentimes we hear about the history, and the history is complicated, and there is so much to it, and there's many layers, and it's very nuanced, and it's not so complicated that you can't get it. It's not so complicated that you can't look at a situation and see what's going on. So let me help a little bit with what's going on right now. I'm going to share my screen here quickly. And here we go. So I'm going to share a little bit about what's happening now in Gaza. So these are taken from today. We have at least 24,000 murdered, killed, and so these are just the numbers that you can see that's happening right now. And this is as of January 15th today. So these are the numbers that are up to date as of now. You can also see what has been happening as far as 3,500, 3,050, 300,005. Okay, just look at the statistics. I'm sorry, I can't say numbers right now. But you can see that as of the
Pastor Jenny, I'm sorry to interrupt, but right now what we're looking at is your "What does SUMUD mean" slide.
oh no, okay. Maybe it's just one behind. Do you see that now?
Not yet.
Is it changing? Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Oh my
Yes.
gosh, it's so much harder to see if you can't see. Let's see. Do you see this now?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Oh my gosh. Thank you for letting me know. That would have been terrible. So here you can see what is happening as of right now. The numbers are updated to today at 1 o'clock. And so 24,100 have been killed, and at least 9,600 of them have been children. So yes, there is a complicated history, there's layers and there's nuance. And again, I'm just going to repeat, it's not so complicated you can't understand it. Numbers tell a story, and here are some numbers for you just so that you can see. Another part of this slide is you'll see the infrastructure also listed here and the damage that has been done. So you can see 370 educational facilities damaged, 121 ambulances. You can see the hospitals that are no longer functioning, the residential homes and units that have been destroyed. Again, numbers tell a story, and these are the stories that are coming out of Gaza as of today. Again, I haven't been able to travel to Bethlehem because the conflict has gotten significantly worse in the last week. As of the news today, you've seen that there's been rising conflict south of Bethlehem as well as north of Bethlehem. And so the numbers tell a story. And so again, it's complicated and it's nuanced and it's layered, but not so much so that you can't understand it. I thought this statistic was really interesting. It says what's happening as of every hour in Gaza. 42 bombs are dropped, 12 buildings are destroyed, 15 people killed, 6 are children, and 35 are injured. So those are just statistics as of the first week as the war in Gaza started to rage. Now, I was just asked to share what's going on now, so I'm just going to stop there and pause and see what we have next.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. So if people want to share questions via the chat, I think we have time for at least one, maybe two questions or that folks want to enter into the conversation? One thing I really appreciated about what you just shared with us, Pastor Jenny, I was listening to public radio yesterday, and there was, I'm sorry that I can't cite who was in conversation, but what was being talked about is the way in which Hamas is embedded into Gaza and the military difficulty on behalf of Israel to attack Gaza without civilian casualties, without infrastructure damage. But the reality of the comparison between the damage that has been done over these last weeks is incredibly stark. So I appreciate your sharing that with us. One
Absolutely.
question I'm sorry. Did you want to respond to that?
Oh, sure. No, I was just saying absolutely. And one thing I talk about is, especially as we're in conversation and about this topic that is nuanced, that is complicated. It's a great time for us to all to practice our brave voice. It doesn't mean you have to get it right. It doesn't mean you have to say it perfectly. It's trying to learn, trying to communicate, trying your best to use your brave voice, practice using your brave voice, and of course, admitting the perspective that you're sharing from. So I'm not Palestinian, and sharing also when you get it wrong as well.
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate your modeling that for us. And I see one way that you did utilize your brave voice is by naming the number of children who have been killed, Palestinian children. I have a question for both of you, and that is, what sources do you look to in terms of news and perspective? Is one of you willing to
Yes.
start? Yeah, thank you.
I can start. I use, so even the statistics I got for you today is brought to you by Al Jazeera, and that they have an English speaking version. And so you can be up to date with the statistics and everything that's happening. And remember that each number is actually a human soul. And then I also I look at Associated Press and Reuters are some of the news outlets I use. For social media, I do look at Churches for Middle East Peace. The ELCJHL has a Facebook and Instagram, so that's our Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and Holy Land, and the EMU, that's IMEU, for some of the resources that I go to.
Wonderful.
And I
And
would
we'll
just add
share all of
to
those
that.
resources. We'll share all of those resources in the email that we send out afterwards. Sorry, Pastor Colin, please share.
No, that's great. I would just add to that. I mean, it is very helpful to hear some of the different narratives, and newsprint is part of that. So Times of Israel is a Israeli moderate daily news. Haaretz, Haaretz, is the moderate left newspaper of Israel, and then there's a Jordanian, 24-hour news called Ma'an, and so it's www.maan.net. And if you get to the Arabic one first, you just look up in the corner and you can push the English button, and there's really hourly things. Also, sometimes, usually their English speaking site is trailing, and so you get it about 12 hours later than Al Jazeera, but they explain a little bit more some of the granular events that are going on in the region.
Thank you. We've received some good questions here. My apologies, I didn't have the right chat box opened up. One of the questions, and I'm going to suggest that we actually defer this question to the resource list. With so many demands on our time and energy, are there small, sustainable ways to support the wounded and displaced? We will address that question in the resource list that we share within a week of this concurrent session in terms of how one can help monetarily. What I'd like to do is use this question to close us out. So Pastors Jenny and Colin, if you want to respond to this question, please. Do you have any advice for how to approach conversation with Christian family members who are pro-Zionist and are identifying with Zionism specifically because of their faith beliefs? If one of you could respond to that.
Yeah, I think this is what we would always spend our closing retreat for the Yagam on, because everybody's had these very powerful experiences, witnessing injustice, hands-on experiences of the occupation, and sometimes people would go home and their family members, because of ideological commitments, wouldn't even want to have the conversation. And so I think one of the pieces that's particularly helpful with any hard conversation like this is to make it personal. And so the way that we discover personal stories, the resource list will have some of these different narrative books that kind of tell a story, but then through our companions. So one of the things that the ELCJHL has really tried to focus on is sharing a little bit more of those personal stories. And then Mitri Raheb, a Lutheran pastor who is responsible with the Dar al-Kalaba University College, also highlights often some of the different things that they're doing in Gaza. They have a university extension in Gaza to teach art and film, and that's been a neat way to hear individual stories.
Thank you. We're feeling the reality of our time crunch right now, folks. So we're going to end with two things. Pastor Jenny, I'd like to ask you this closing question, and then I'll share a couple of brief announcements before we close. So, Pastor Jenny, with what do you want to leave people that are tuned in to today's conversation?
Absolutely. I would say practice your brave voice. Look at the resources we've given you so that you can learn a little more, but practice your brave voice. And when you get it wrong, or when you mess it up, or when you say it wrong, or you mix up the numbers, the humility to admit and to recalibrate. I think right now what we need more than ever are brave people having brave conversations about this topic, because I think so often we're afraid to even open the door or open the conversation or step on, something that we didn't mean to, like a trigger word or something. But and that goes into the conversations with your families is I think of the story on social media that was going around of the grandfather who lost his grandchild, and he was just holding her, saying my heart, my love. And there were these pictures just going, and it's just like, oh my gosh, when you see photos like that, when you see a movement of people sharing their grief and their pain so that somebody will look. My other encouragement is to not look away, but to look in the face of grief and remember your humanity in all of it.
Thank you so much.
And John, I think it's worth echoing just something you brought up at the beginning, which is that you don't have to rush to judgment. There's so much we can learn, far before we ever get into, solutions for the conflict. And so, because solutions make you choose a side, and when it comes to the hurt that this conflict has caused, it's in every different direction. And so, hearing the story that brought these, very diverse groups of people to the Holy Land, and the stories of, conflict that have come out of this, the stories of resilience and hope are so much more beautiful than, those that when you get into who's been wronged by whom. And so hopefully we can be curious for those hopeful stories.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone for entering into this conversation. I want to share three announcements here at the end. As I mentioned earlier, we'll share a document of resources. And one of those resources that you'll see on that document is further information about the ELCA's SUMUD, which Pastor Jenny is the launch coordinator for SUMUD, for Justice in Palestine and Israel. And I'll be following up with Pastor Jenny, inviting a further conversation yet this semester about SUMUD specifically. So if you're interested in that, make sure to let me know. You can email me at leiseth@cord.edu. That's Leiseth @cord.edu. Another announcement that I want to share is that Campus Ministry is hosting an MLK chapel this coming Thursday, and our guest preacher is the Reverend Dr. Saeed Ailabuni. And Reverend Ailabuni grew up in Nazareth and has served as an ELCA pastor and also served in global service in relationship to this very region of the world, and is a Palestinian person himself.
And a cobber.
And a cobber, yes. So please join us. You can join us in person on Thursday at 10 minutes to 10 a.m. in the Centrum. You can also stream that chapel online. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today.